back to the Fierce Kittens Studio channel, where today I'm going to talk about how to move into vinyl for bag making and the tips and the tricks that you need in order to be successful. So when you want to get into bag making, usually you just start with fabrics, and it's the easiest thing to start with, especially if you have a domestic machine. But once you've kind of gotten the swing of things and you feel ready to do more advanced work, a lot of people will look toward doing vinyl. And you can start with a vinyl that is bought just from a local store, or you can actually go to specialty shops like Mikri World LLC or My Punk Broidery to get these cool looking holographic and glitter and rainbow and scale looking crazy vinyls. These are awesome. But they're also really expensive, so you have to be really careful. And so I usually tell people, like, if you want to start with this, take a step back first and start looking at just a standard marine vinyl that you can get at Joann's. So what you're looking for in a vinyl that's good for bag making is something that is relatively thick, has not a lot of stretch on it, because honestly, you're going to probably use this stuff in load-bearing areas, such as the base of the bag or strapping. And so what you'll find is that if you use a stretchier vinyl, it's going to perforate and rip, which we will get into later with sewing techniques. But so you can get all these different vinyls. This is like a marine vinyl, and marine vinyl is one of the thicker vinyl options that has a coating of plastic over the top with a nice tight mesh underneath it, and it's really thick. And this is the kind of stuff where you do need to consider having a machine that can handle heavy duty layers, or use some little tips and tricks like I will give you later in the video. Then there's a lighter weight style that is cotton fleece backed, like this one, and like this one is somewhat thick, but it's thick in terms of, like, it's got kind of more of like a cardstock feel to it. And I usually advise that if you're going to use this should be accent only. I probably wouldn't make this as like a load-bearing fabric, like the base of a bag. Definitely wouldn't want to do that unless you interface the crap out of it. So that leads us into the interfacing discussion, but for the purposes of demonstration today, I will be using my regular sewing machine. It's a domestic machine, and I will be using this marine vinyl that I just picked up at Joann's. Nothing special, nothing terribly expensive. So when using your vinyl and getting prepared for sewing, sometimes people ask, do I need to interface it? The answer is yes and no. It really just depends on the kind of bag that you're making and the kind of vinyl that you're using. If it's a thinner vinyl that's not a marine vinyl, I usually suggest go ahead and put a very thin layer of a woven interfacing over it, just to kind of strengthen it a little bit, especially if it's cotton fleece backed. You'll find that that one needs a little bit extra to kind of keep that thin layer of plastic on the top of the vinyl from ripping while you're working with it. So that's something to consider. Now, when you're going to go and press your vinyl, you need to use a slightly lower heat than you would if you were working with fabric, and you need to move in very quick sweeping motions. If the iron hovers over an area for too long, then the likelihood of the plastic layer on the vinyl melting is too dang high for comfort. So I usually say just like quickly either press down or make a sweeping motion with the iron. Don't linger too long in one area if you can help it. The other thing is, please don't put it in a heat press. If you put it in a heat press, it's probably going to also press away the texture that is on the vinyl on the front of it. So you're going to end up with this really weird, wonky looking, untextured fabric that you're going to use for your bag. Ask me how I know it happened. It was bad. Don't suggest it. So yeah, but yeah. So strongly suggest using a woven interfacing. You can use things like Decaville and such on it. If it's a highly structured bag, I will even use foam interfacing, and I will just use like some 505 basting spray to basically spray base the foam to it before sewing it. I don't normally worry about the foam being in my seams because I normally sew with an industrial, but foam is actually really compact and easy to sew with. I don't find that it adds too much bulk at all for me. Okay, so on to sewing topics. How do you sew the vinyl? So the best thing I can tell you to start off with is to use a larger needle for one. You're going to want to get a denim needle that is size 16 or 18. 18 is kind of hard to find, 16 you can usually find in the store. And then you're also going to want to use a longer stitch length. Some people will tell you to use a smaller stitch length, something closer to 2.5. If you do that, you're going to perforate the fabric. So you remember how I told you the vinyl has a layer of plastic on top of it? Every time the needle goes through, it punches a hole into that plastic. So if you remember from middle school and high school when you had to rip out your notebook paper and it ripped really easily because of the tiny holes, the same thing happens to vinyl, especially if it's a vinyl that's not thicker like a marine vinyl. So usually I would tell people use closer to a 3 or 3.5 millimeter stitch length. If you want, you can go higher than that, but then you kind of run the risk of being able to like see the thread between the seams, and that's not actually really good. You don't want to do that level, but what it does is it's just enough spacing in between the holes for at least a strong vinyl not to rip under pressure. The next tip that I'm going to give you is that when you have vinyl on a load-bearing seam, again, the bottom of the bag or on up at the top where the flap is connected on a messenger, you are going to want to do 2 rows of stitching. You're going to do your first row, which is at your actual seam allowance. Usually it's about a ½ inch in bags. Some pattern companies like to do 3/8. Either way, follow your bag's pattern instructions. The next thing you're going to do is once you have that first line of stitching done, you're going to do a second line of stitching in the seam allowance portion that's going to be 1/8 of an inch away. What this does is it helps balance the weight and distribute it between those 2 lines of stitching. This also has the beautiful side effect of hiding the thread so that when you pull apart the vinyl, it doesn't actually show you the thread bits. So that's something that you'll get a lot with like the thicker fabrics when you go to a longer stitch length. And so this kind of helps a bit with that. This trick can also work if you're using just a heavier woven fabric like canvas or duck cloth. The next thing is, a lot of this stuff is really sticky. I'm gonna do this case in point. These are 2 glitter marine vinyls. They're very sticky. Little ASMR for you. That and my neighbor's drill, if you can hear that. Anyway, it's very sticky. So if you're gonna put this on your sewing machine, oftentimes the stitch plate and the presser foot are going to stick to the vinyl. And it's very annoying because you'll be like, it's not moving, it won't go anywhere. And that's because basically it just gets stuck to all the things. So there's a couple of ways to abate that risk. The first thing you can do is you can put a sheet of tissue paper underneath your work if you need to do something like top stitch it. I usually try to keep the vinyl away from the stitch plate and sew with it presser foot facing up so that I don't have to worry about that. I only have to worry about the presser foot. The other thing is if you do want to use the tissue paper, it is a good alternative, especially if you have a bunch of it laying around because kids' birthday parties at last minute. But you can... The problem is, like, when you go to rip it off at the end, you find yourself having to grab tweezers and pull it out of every little stitch. It doesn't come out as cleanly as you would like. So that's something to consider. The best solution that I can think of, if you can't get a Teflon foot for your machine, or at least if your machine didn't come with one, is to grab ye old Scotch tape, or whatever brand you prefer, and take a strip of it or 2 and put it under the foot. This will give your foot the protection it needs to glide that fabric and pull it along so it doesn't get stuck under the machine. It's really annoying, but it does work. Okay, so when you're moving into vinyl, again, this is another one of those tips that I give in a lot of videos, regardless of what it is you're doing or working with. If you have thick seams, you may find that you're going to need a humper jumper. This is a little seam jumper tool that basically goes behind the presser foot and underneath the presser foot to help you glide over thicker seams. So if you're going to start using vinyl, you probably will find that at least on a domestic machine, you are going to need something like this. Now, last thing, when you're working with vinyl, wait, I say that a lot. All right. Last tip, holes are permanent. Go slow, be steady, and very careful when you're stitching with vinyl. Every hole that you make is a permanent addition to your product. So if you need to pick out the seam, you're going to have to slide back a bit. If you found that you skipped some stitches, you're also going to want to kind of go back over that area again. And what I strongly suggest in that point is to try to place your needle in one of the holes that was already stitched. Don't just slam that needle down anywhere that it'll go just because you're frustrated and you want to get that line of stitching in. Try very hard to get the needle directly in there so that at least mathematically you're going to keep your stitch length and you won't make additional holes. Because again, like I said in the earlier portion of the video, vinyl can perforate and it will rip. So I hope this video helped you, and I hope that you're feeling brave enough to give vinyl a try. As always, feel free to like and subscribe the video. Tell your friends about it. Put up Facebook posts. I love that stuff. And if you like live streaming of sewing, you can catch me on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays on twitch.tv/fiercekittens. I start around 9 p.m. Eastern, and I sew for a couple hours. So I hope to see you there, and I hope to hear anything from you, feedback in the comments section below. Thank you.